This is AudioFile Magazine Online. I'm Josephine Reed. It's not very often that audiobook narrators and authors discuss the book they've both worked so hard to produce. And AudioFile Magazine editor Robin Whitten wanted to change that. At Book Expo 2017 in New York City, she invited author James Patterson and actor Edoardo Ballerini to sit down and chat about The Black Book, a recent Patterson book narrated by Ballerini. James Patterson, on the off chance you don't know, is a prolific author of well over 100 thrillers, including the series Alex Cross and NYPD Red. He calls The Black Book his best in 20 years. Edoardo Ballerini is a gifted actor who's equally at home in film and television, and he's pure magic in front of a microphone. We're going to hear an excerpt of Edoardo Ballerini reading from James Patterson's The Black Book. And then it's on to Jim and Edoardo talking about audiobooks in general and The Black Book in particular. But first...
I'd chosen the subway platform for this bogus meeting because it was hard to follow me there without giving yourself away. Whoever was tailing me couldn't hide in the darkness of a car with the headlights blazing, couldn't watch from a safe distance with binoculars. No. If this person wanted to know whom I was supposedly meeting with, he'd have to get himself on that damn platform. And for all he knew, I might jump onto an arriving train and he'd have to follow. I picked 6 o'clock because it would be busy. If it was too late in the evening, the platform would be empty, and he'd be afraid to follow me down there because he'd feel exposed. At 6, he'd feel comfortable in the knowledge that he could blend into a crowd while watching me and my supposed meeting partner. The catch in my plan? There was no actual meeting, obviously, and nobody was bringing me anything. That part, I had to improvise. That's what friends are for.
That was Edoardo Ballerini reading from James Patterson's The Black Book. Jim Patterson and Edoardo Ballerini had never met before they sat down together at the Book Expo, but they got on famously, so I mostly stayed out of the way, asking the odd question here and there. But I did begin the conversation by asking Edoardo Ballerini how he came to narrate audiobooks.
I came to audiobooks after many years in film and television, which I still do, when somebody approached me to do a recording of Machiavelli's The Prince, because I speak Italian, and I said, sure. And then from there, it just sort of took off. Now I find myself also listening, especially at night when I'm sort of too tired to hold a book and actually read it. I can lie back in bed and sort of dim the lights and listen to something.
And Jim, when did you first get interested in audiobooks?
For me, when I moved out of New York City and started driving my car all the time, that's when I became addicted to audiobooks. And I do not get in my car without putting an audiobook in now. Right now, it's astrophysics for people in a hurry, which I don't understand a word of it, but I'm listening anyway.
That's the value of a good narrator, even if you don't know what you're listening to.
Right. What?
You keep going.
What did he say?
Exactly.
No, I think that's true.
Right.
Jim, what about the first time you heard one of your books? Do you remember what one it was?
No, I don't remember. I listened to some. I don't listen. I listened to Black Book. I thought it was terrific because I love the book. It's not a lot of them. I don't listen to them on audiobook. I mean, I've already been through them 10 times at that stage. One of the things about listening to them, though, is you do get a good feel for when your dialogue stinks. You really do. You go like, you know what? That just is bad. That's bad.
Do you find that some things read better on the page?
So what I want to do from now on is I actually want, with the manuscript, I want you to read it, and then I'll know what to fix.
We'll drive around. You have a live audiobook happening in your car.
But to piggyback on your question, do you ever read what you've written out loud to see how it lands?
I wouldn't say I read it out loud. I read it in my head. That might be not a bad idea, too, to read it out loud, but I don't do that.
Do you remember the first James Patterson?
It must have been the NYPD Red, which we've done, I believe, 4 of now. And I did...
Wait a minute. We've only done 3.
Oh, okay.
You've done one I haven't even written yet.
I secretly wrote a 4th one.
Excellent.
Because I felt I knew the characters so well at this point.
Yeah, probably.
Anyway, Jay Snyder, another actor, narrator, and I, we split duties on that one, and I believe that was the first one I did.
You do the women voices, too? That's something I could never do in a million years.
Yeah, somebody...
do one of the women voices.
Somebody once told me that they really appreciate the way I do women's voices because I don't try to make them sound too...
You mean like
feminine.
that?
Yeah, exactly. I don't do falsetto. There
Yeah.
was somebody who said, I really like the way you do women because it doesn't sound like you're trying to sound like a woman, but I still understand that it's a woman. But, you know, with Mr. Patterson's books, all the characters are so well drawn that it's kind of hard to go wrong. One thing I always tell people is that a good book is a lot easier to narrate than a bad one, because you're following. It's like you're going downstream. You're just sort of going along with it. And you don't have to do that much work. You really just have to connect the dots that have been laid out before you. So I found with all of your book, the characters are so specific and unique that it's they're easy to differentiate.
Yeah, I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it in a million years.
Pacing is so important in your books, in the way you write it, but also in the way you narrate it. How do you set a tone? First as a writer, because you have a sense of where you want to leave people at the end of each chapter, but then as the narrator.
Well, Michael Connelly, best-selling mystery writer, what he said, what Jim does is every single chapter moves both the characterization and the plot forward and turns on the movie projector in our heads. Whether I succeed or don't succeed, I'm always trying to do that. And I want people to see the scene. If we're in a room or if we're on a prayer, I want them to feel that they're there. I think audiobooks can be quintuple what it is now in terms of popularity. And the productions could be a lot richer. So one of the things we might try to do with the book with President Clinton is really go for the kind of production that I don't think anybody's done yet on an audiobook. I don't mean just multiple characters, which has been done.
Do you mean like the way the old radio dramas
Yeah,
used to be done?
high production
Right,
values,
yeah.
state of the art. Even in radio, in terms of sound design, we've come a long way. Although they knew all the tricks back then.
I agree. I've often said, and I know it can be cost prohibitive unless you have bestsellers such as yours, but to have sound effects, to have all this kind of richness behind it, to make the production bigger would make the whole thing better. But I did want to say something about pacing, and also what Michael Connelly said about the visual nature of your books, which I find to be very true. That I feel like I'm watching a movie often when I'm reading these books, because everything comes so alive, and I can really see the clothes and the buildings and the cars, and it comes alive that way. The pacing, again, is so dictated by the writer that I feel like it's there waiting for me to follow. If you have a lot of staccato short sentences, that's going to suggest something. If you have these long flowing sentences, that's going to tell you what the author wants in terms of pace. As I've always believed, and I know Robin Whitten and I have discussed this, that the narrator is in service to the author, that it's my job to present the book as the author intended it. And so I look for these clues. I look for the kind of sentence structure. I look for the kind of characterizations, and I try to follow that.
Would you mind going out to Hollywood and explaining that to all of the script writers, the
Here's what we're gonna
showrunners,
do.
the
We're going to
actors?
get in a car. We're going to drive. I'm going to read your next few books aloud to you.
On
so
the
you
way
can hear
to
them.
L.A.,
We're going
yes.
to get to LA. We're going to set up some meetings, and
Excellent.
we're finally going to make something happen out there.
Well, when you're writing, do you see the books in your head as though it were a movie?
Well, not as though it's a movie, but one of the drafts I will be there at the top of a lot of chapters, meaning be in the scene. If you want your reader to be there when they're reading, you need to deliver that. What was the intent? Is it a funny scene? Is it a very emotional scene? Is it an erotic scene? And if you don't feel any of that, you probably haven't succeeded with the writing.
How do you begin with a book?
It's some idea that I find irresistible. For example, with one of the things with Black Book that I really liked trying to do is a detective who is a stand-up comedian. Not dark cop humor. Actually, there was a script developed for Black Book, which they didn't buy, and I thought it was great. And I thought, once again, the idea of a really good actor playing that character where he can be dramatic, but he can also be comedic, you don't see that very much.
Plot-driven, character-driven, which way do you go, or just a combination of both?
I think what Connelly said. I do believe that, especially with this kind of fiction, that action reveals character.
These books, they're thrillers, they're action-driven, but they also have a lot of character and humanity in them. And what I like as a reader and as a narrator is that you'll get these stretches of action, a lot of happening, and then there'll be a sort of quiet moment where something about the characters revealed, sort of who they are and why this is affecting them in a certain way. And it just comes at you, and it's like a leitmotif or something in music that just keeps coming through, which I very much appreciate.
With the cross books, that's the key to the cross books. That, yes, he's a detective. Yes, obviously it's larger than life in terms of what he goes through as a policeman. But the reason people keep coming back again and again is the human being, the grandson of Nana Mama. It's sort of like it with a TV series. You know, you know that's going to be a pretty good story, but you like to see those characters every week.
You're invested in them.
Yeah.
Well, if a character isn't relatable to anybody, then it's going to fall on its face, right? It's like the superhero has to be flawed. The larger-than-life tycoon has to be very human, whatever the character is. They can be a king or they can be a pauper, it doesn't matter, but they have to have something human about them so that we can feel like, oh yeah, I understand what they're going through.
Okay, listen, are sex scenes hard to write or are they hard to narrate?
No, but you know when it's working, when it isn't. I mean, for example, you know, I do NYPD Red with Marshall Karp. Marshall's very funny, and Marshall is not a good writer of sex scenes. So we have to struggle a lot with that stuff. I don't think that's the strong suit of NYPD Red. In Black Book, I think such as it was, I think the scenes there, and they're not very graphic, but I think they ring pretty true. In the early Cross especially, I think the sex scenes are pretty good.
They're not particularly graphic, and there aren't too many of them, fortunately. Right. Otherwise, you're into erotic, essentially. I'll say this, they're easier to narrate than they are to film, for film and television, having had to do a few in my career. That's awkward. That, I will tell you, is awkward, but reading them is okay.
You have so many plot twists in your book, and you scatter a certain amount of clues. They're like little breadcrumbs that an observant reader can follow and perhaps anticipate a twist here, a twist there, though there are always surprises. How do you think about placing those, letting people know so it's not completely out of the realm of possibility when the plot twists?
If you haven't made it credible, I mean, look, all of these stories, it's not realism. I don't do realism. It's funny that every once in a while somebody will say, well, it didn't seem very real to me. And I always think about, somebody looking at Picasso and going, it didn't seem very real to me. It's not. It's not. It wasn't meant to be. And then you can say, I don't like it, but I don't do realism. I do something else. It's stylized, it's operatic, and you can like it or not like it, but it isn't realism.
But you have to be true to the world that you create in that book.
Yeah, right. Organic unity.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's hyper-realism, but at the same time, it's not so fantastical that it's incredible in the purest sense of that word. So it's hyper-realism, but it's still, you can imagine it happening.
Yes.
If you stretch
Well,
just
that's
a
the
little bit.
thing. The individual scenes, okay, yeah. If you think about the whole thing, you go, I don't know about this.
It's like sometimes if you see an action movie, that to me is absurdist because you'll see people, jumping out of an exploding plane and somehow like toppling down, the side of a mountain and getting up and running. That's ridiculous. But you won't find that in your book. So I feel like it's hyper realism.
I've been missing that, but somewhere along the way I'll learn my lesson.
What about accuracy with accents?
I try. I do my best. I study them before we get into the room. To me, it's more important that you get the characterization of the person right. I think a listener will forgive if the accent is slightly off, but if the character is alive to them.
I think sometimes the funny ones, Tom Clancy used to put like 20 different accents.
Just to screw with
be
the
in
narrator.
Germany, be in Russia,
Right.
and you would just hear, and all of a sudden, wait a minute, that Israeli is talking like the Russian.
Right. It gets hard to differentiate, which, back to your point, it'd be nice to have a multicast, recording, so you have everybody doing it. I did one book, not one of yours, mercifully, that had about 20 Russians in a room. And, it was just sort of going, it's a whirlwind conversation of 20 Russians. I just threw my hands up. I was like, they're all going to sound the same at this point. There's no way I can keep these guys separate.
Jim creates a visual picture on a page, and then you take it to another level with your voice.
Yeah. You try to submerge yourself into the story, and you try as simply as possible to be an honest storyteller. And somebody once gave me the advice of, imagine that you're talking to one person. Rather than you're speaking to a crowd, but that you're telling a story to somebody.
That's exactly what I try to do.
Yeah.
Exactly that.
And so that has served me well. And now I have 2 small children, and I read to them all the time. And I have to say, I feel like they've actually made me a better narrator.
Did they like Black Book?
They loved it. They loved it. The sex scenes in particular, they're all about it. Because you really have to talk to one person.
Storytelling. Can we talk about that? Because this is what you both do. And just the significance of storytelling, I think, is vast.
I have a big imagination, obviously. And I have a file in my office called Cleverly Ideas. And it's hundreds of ideas for books. With Black Book, one of the things that I haven't done that often is back and forth between two time frames.
Yeah.
And where going back and forth, that really dramatized some of the things that happened.
I agree that stories give our lives meaning, in that, what other reason do we have for living or listening to these things? The idea of the different time frames was interesting. I felt that, and I think there's something that happens to a listener, that even a subtle change, that they can register it. It's almost like if you have two different shades of the same color on a wall, that the eye can recognize that they're slightly different. So when we were going from past to present, I tried to approach it slightly differently, that maybe there was a slightly different rhythm, a slightly different cadence, maybe one had a little more volume or something like that to differentiate them. And I do think that listeners are smart and that they can latch on to that. Storytelling is the oldest thing in the world. From the cave paintings to the audiobook, right?
Yeah, that's one of the tricky things. When I was growing up, oral storytelling was a pretty big deal, and before that was even a bigger deal. And people got good at it. They practiced it a lot. That's what you did. You went home, you told stories. And the ability to tell stories, I think, is diminished now. And I don't think it was an accident that a lot of very good writers developed in the United States from the South, because I think that storytelling was remained a more important thing in the South longer than it did in other areas. And now I think storytelling is getting a little sloppy. It's, for whatever reason, it seems to be flourishing on television more than in movies. Mm-hmm. Movies, it's a lot of it is abysmal. It's not storytelling. No. It's just marketing. It's just, okay, well, we found out they want 92 explosions and whatever the heck it is. Not 91, 92. Right. Yeah. 7 sex scenes. Yeah. That's the magic number. I think the storytelling in television is interesting because it speaks to the idea that people want a character that they can follow for a little while. TV writers that I know are very grateful for this change and how content is being delivered, because it gives them a chance to develop characters. So even in a case where we have a series like the NYPD Red series, we get to follow these characters, and the listeners that have been with it from book one, they get to see more and more of these, and it becomes a richer experience.
Yeah.
That's one of the nice things about a series, from my point of view, is they're thrillers and they're supposed to thrill, and things need to move along. But when you do a series, you can keep revealing more of the character over time. That's nice from my point of view as a writer.
You've done a great deal for literacy. Do you see audiobooks as being helpful?
Oh, totally. Yeah, no, audiobooks are great. We know that listening to audiobooks improves comprehension. We know that. We know that kids on audiobooks, they're 2 grade levels better than they are as readers, which is really useful. It helps their vocabulary. It helps to learn them to read faster. So it's a very valuable tool, but it's just not being used that much, especially with kids.
And what about you with your little ones now? How old are they?
5 and 2. And yes, the 5-year-old is listening to audiobooks now. He's a fan of the Frog and Toad series. So. Which is the Hemingway of children's books.
We'll keep that in mind. And there we'll leave it, gentlemen.
Right.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Good.
Thank you. That was author James Patterson and actor Edoardo Ballerini talking about The Black Book, which was written by Patterson and narrated by Ballerini. I'm Jo Reed, and this has been AudioFile Magazine Online.